Welcome, everyone. We're going to give everyone else just another minute or so to check in. We know there was a lot of celebrating going on in Ann Arbor, and not everybody's fully recovered even by 5 o'clock on Monday from the victory of good over evil, which I hope you all enjoyed this weekend. And we'll give people just a minute or two to join our conversation. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our panel on ESG, the corporate perspective. Really excited to see you back from Thanksgiving. I hope everyone had a magical holiday break. I know I did. I know that everyone enjoyed Saturday. If you didn't enjoy Saturday, you might be at the wrong school, but really excited to be back together now. I'm Jerry Davis. I'm the faculty director of the Business+Impact initiative at the Ross School. I'm also the faculty advisor for Ross's new ESG concentration for the MBA program. Really delighted to be here today to welcome this distinguished panel of experts. We have a rich diversity of experience and expertise here. Really excited about the conversation that we're about to have. And before we dive in, I need to be really clear and set the right expectations. This is not a recruiting panel. So our aim here is not to tell you how to ace the interview and get that fancy consulting job that you're all angling for. We're really here to learn from people who are on the front lines of doing ESG. What do you need to know, and what do you need to know how to do, and how can you be effective in the world of ESG? So this is really aimed not at giving you interview tips, but at learning more about the world of ESG and what our experts have been experiencing out there. And this panel and other events we've been doing, like the data workshop we did a couple of weeks ago, all grew out of a process that we used to launch the ESG concentration here at Ross. And you'll be delighted to know students were heavily involved in this. We actually assembled a team of MBA students and faculty. We saw an opportunity to try to create a meaningful educational experience all around ESG. And as part of that journey, we interviewed people out there in the work world about their experience in ESG and what can best prepare people for careers around ESG. And the interviews yielded insights and surprises that shaped what went into the curriculum and the other co-curricular offerings that we're also doing. We thought it'd be helpful to share some of those insights with students to give them a better sense of what they're likely to see out there. And with that in mind, we assembled today's panel of 4 experts. First, Laura Asiala is the Chief Sustainability Officer of WholeWorks LLC and the lead facilitator for their strategic ESG Creating Sustainable Value professional certificate program. Prior to that, Laura spent 30 years at Dow Corning and ultimately served as the company's Director of Corporate Communications and Corporate Citizenship. Shayla Campbell is a director in the EY Parthenon Strategy and Transactions practice. She advises clients through the complexities of M&A transactions. Shayla's been closely involved with the firm's enhanced ESG mission and has helped develop the company's sustainability and ESG service offerings. Prior to that, she worked with clients in Uganda, India, Croatia, and Tunisia, and across several industries, including fintech and apparel. David Feber is a senior partner at McKinsey, working primarily in consumer packaged goods and industrials. Prior to rejoining McKinsey, David spent many years in industry. He served as a CEO of a publicly traded early-stage fastening tech company. I have to point out that David is a Ross alum and took my core MBA class in 2001, and he was the smartest kid in the class, and now he's a partner at McKinsey. So kids, pay attention like David did. Thank you for that, David. And Tim Mohin is partner and director of climate and sustainability at the Boston Consulting Group. He's formerly the chief executive of the Global Reporting Initiative, the world's largest sustainability reporting standard. Prior to BCG, Tim was also the EVP and Chief Sustainability Officer, the leading carbon accounting software company, previously led sustainability functions at Intel, Apple, and AMD. So you can see we have an incredible set of diverse career experiences and deep expertise on this panel. I just want to point to all of you on the call that if you want to learn more about ESG and you want to learn more about the concentration, just go to the website, send me an email, tell you everything I need to do. That is the end of our unpaid advertising. So it'd be great if we could start with just a sense of your own roles and how you found yourself in ESG, because you all came from really pretty different backgrounds and have had different paths. So I wonder, Tim, if we could start with you about this. You've been at this for some time now.
I'd be glad to, Jerry, and thanks. Wonderful introduction. And, I think we're all Michigan fans today, so we'll just start there. Not pandering to the audience or anything, but no, I wanted to maybe start off by just saying I have always been in sustainability. I did the math the other day. This is my 40th year of working in this space, which is a very, very long time. So I got involved in sustainability before we had the word sustainability, before it was cool to do that. I didn't have the great fortune of going to the University of Michigan. I went to Duke University and graduated with a Master of Environmental Management. But just to give you a sense of the times back then, the school was called now it's called the School of the Environment, the Nicholas School. Then it was called Duke University Forestry and Environmental Studies. And if you do the abbreviation, it spells out DUFES or DUFUS, which was very much apropos for what we were at the time, which was a little bit odd, right? It wasn't so much of a career as it is today. So my choice back then was you could either join an NGO and sort of shake your fist at companies, or join the government, because companies weren't doing this kind of work. So I chose to join the government. I was a regulator for the first 10 years of my career at EPA. Then I worked in the United States Senate and worked on legislation such as clean air, clean water, Superfund, et cetera. But my kind of claim to fame back then was environmental technology. very much ahead of our time, because we're seeing that today in the Inflation Reduction Act, industrial policy aimed at joining the environment and the economy through technology, which I think is a very apt thing to do. As Jerry mentioned, I then went to the private sector, worked at Intel, worked at Apple, worked at AMD. And over that time is when we really saw corporations taking on the role that government NGOs had played, moving faster than government in many cases, going beyond what the regulations required, doing things across not just environment, but social issues and governance issues, and looking up and down the supply chain as well. So for example, when I left Intel, where I was the head of the environmental and sustainability program, I went to Apple, and it was all about supply chain. And many of you probably remember when Apple was on the cover of the New York Times, for example, for alleged and sometimes true issues dealing with social and labor conditions in the supply chain. That was the program that I headed up at Apple. At AMD, it was all of those things wrapped together. So the environmental, the social, the governance, all of it as what became now very much a term of art, the chief sustainability officer for a large company. But what held all that together was the red thread of transparency. In every case, companies disclose what they're doing to the public in terms of a sustainability, and hopefully it'll come up in our discussion today, because after 2 decades of reporting on sustainability matters, what's happened is investors have taken notice. They said some of this information that's been reported voluntarily for decades now actually has material interests in identifying risks and new opportunities for investors. And so now what's happening today is the integration of financial disclosure and ESG disclosure across the world. So we're seeing new regulations, new standards, and it's really rippling through the economy. So that's why I'm at BCG. We are very much serving clients who are going through that transformation right now, and doing so not just to sort of tick the box for compliance, but looking for the value proposition that brings to these companies. And again, it's affecting across the economy, every sector and every region. So I'm very much excited to be here today, and I'm looking forward to non-football related questions that you might have. So thanks for that introduction, Jerry.
Fantastic. We will be able to serve your interests and skip the football for the rest of our conversation, I think. Laura, tell us about your journey.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I started my journey also about 40 years ago, but unlike Tim, I would say that I grew up in sustainability inside of an organization, believe it or not, that was on part of the forefront in material science. So I came up in my career through the Dow Corning Corporation. That's now part of Dow Inc. And if you take a look at their website, you might be surprised to find out that Dow is in its 3rd set of 10-year sustainability goals. Really appreciate Tim's comment also on transparency, because that gets into what is the E, the S, and the G. So the E is pretty clear, and that's environmental, and social is pretty clear, and S is, for social, that's pretty clear. But that governance part is also really important, and it plays a really important role in terms of transparency, in terms of reporting how you make decisions, how your organization is set up. It's typically not something that an early career person necessarily has a lot of impact on, but it's definitely something that you want to keep an eye on because it's important. And I think here, when we were talking about sustainability coming through, we learned early on that was about, people, planet, profit, the triple bottom line, or, sometimes people would characterize that as economic, environmental, and equity. But here we're talking about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And this is where things get really interesting, because what Tim mentioned in terms of reporting and the fact that investors and now customers are increasingly asking for that. And what you take a look at with ESG is, what are the environmental, social, and governance issues that have the most material impact on your business. And that's where the CFO and the CSO become best friends. And I am really excited about that. I retired from the Dow Corning Corporation after 30 years and went to work in international development, where I worked for a firm called Pixera Global. And what we did was we helped bring large corporations into underserved communities around the world and to partner with nonprofits and small business in areas where there were deserts of food or business or opportunity. And then I left Pixera Global after about 8 years, returned to the state of Michigan, and now I work at WholeWorks, which is a small specialty consulting firm, and we specialize in helping practicing leaders and functional experts inside of their organizations accelerate their ability to integrate sustainability with the work that they do.
Oh, thank you so much. And Shayla, so our conversation last February has really struck with me because you had so many insights based on sort of your international experience and what you're seeing at the firm and with clients around ESG. And I took notes and realized there's 20 electives that I would like to teach based on our conversation. So, so Shayla, tell us about your trajectory.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And that might be because I am a little bit closer to the student body than some of the panelists in my tenure. And I was only in your as an audience seat about 5 years ago. But just to take it back a little bit further, I've always been interested in sustainability since I was in high school, and and kind of global affairs, and started a club around the genocide in Darfur, so things of that nature. It's always kind of been an interest of mine, and studied international affairs and philosophy at liberal arts college, moved to New York, worked in public affairs and marketing, mostly in the financial services sector, started leaning more towards the policy angle, and then decided to go back to Columbia University. And so I was there for 3 years doing a dual degree at the policy school, which is SIPA, and then also at the business school. And so those 3 years were really the time where I was charting how can I combine my passion for international development and sustainability with a longer term career that touches the private sector. I kind of had tangential experiences working with NGOs in the United Nations, and realized at this point in my career, at least, I want to understand and learn, kind of follow the money. Where is this coming from? Who are the stakeholders who are new to the table, who might be change makers? And so really started focusing on how to make that happen for myself and for clients. And so my past 3+ years at EY Parthenon, I've been working on honing my business set. And then, of course, the past year and a half have been pretty much solely focused to developing our sustainability service offerings and working with clients on that front. A lot of what our group does, we have transaction advisory, and we also have strategy advisory services. So, that's been an interesting area around how does this come into play during transactions. There's been a lot of interesting things going on around infrastructure. I think Tim mentioned the IRA. When you think about following the money, when I originally was, okay, this is, the corporates are really going to make a move. We've had a big influx of, public capital recently. So things are always evolving. And I think it's good to kind of try to be agile enough to approach this and interact with different stakeholders, so you can be as effective as possible in the challenges of the day that are coming up.
Fantastic, thank you. And David, Ross alum.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today. I am David Feber. I'm a senior partner with McKinsey and a proud Ross alum. And Dr. Davis, I appreciate the kind words of introduction. I don't think they were all true. I think your class was definitely one of my favorites, but I was far from your best student. But I appreciate that. I think if any of the participants get anything out of this today is you should take Dr. Davis's classes because they're fantastic. At least for me, they're of the most memorable as I look back almost 20 years ago since I did my MBA. So I joined. Look, I started out my career as a civil and environmental engineer. Wasn't really in sustainability. I was in transportation, but I'd studied it a bit. Went for an MBA and joined McKinsey out of Ross. Really because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up and figured this would be a good way to prolong the inevitable. And I really wanted to be a CEO and run businesses, which I did. After 5 years of staying at McKinsey, I left and I became a CEO of an early stage publicly traded company. And then from there migrated into the packaging industry. So think about like metal, glass, plastic, paper, packaging. And that's where I've spent the majority of my career. And in packaging, sustainability has been a part of packaging really for decades. What's changed is it's finally hit a tipping point where consumers, shareholders, capital markets, brands are actually making changes and willing to pay for changes that are more sustainable. And so it's really hit a tipping point. But for me, I kind of fell into sustainability. I was in the packaging industry working for actually a large packaging company based in Ann Arbor, making mostly plastic bottles. And our sustainability started out, which became one of my responsibilities at the company, really initially inwardly focused on our plants, on our carbon footprint, on our water usage, on our waste to energy, and then migrated to external, to our customers and recycled content, and making sure we had fully recyclable products so that they could be reused over and over and not create waste. I came back to McKinsey about 7 years ago, and I lead their global packaging practice. So I spend all of my time in the packaging industry with companies that make packaging. And I spend a lot of my time counseling CEOs and boards on their overall strategy and operations, but especially as it relates to sustainability and ESG. And it has really hit a tipping point. I would say 4 or 5 years ago, it was not a top agenda item for most CEOs. And today it is. Almost every CEO has some element of ESG, which includes sustainability and the other factors we mentioned, especially social, on their agenda. They're reporting to shareholders. They're thinking about their employees and they're thinking about their customers. And I think it's always on companies and CEOs' minds has always been focusing on shareholder and shareholder value as their chief constituency. But more and more today, other constituents are becoming very important to companies and to CEOs that are non-financial. And so there's a very much of a blended agenda that's taken place. And I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit. The challenge is that to do the right thing and to make things more sustainable, in many cases, is very expensive. And so finding creative ways to fund that, offset that, get paid for it, and run a profitable business is where a lot of the thinking and challenge comes in. I think with all the panelists, and I'm sure for all of you in your careers, as you go think about sustainability, it is the thinking across multiple dimensions to come up with the optimal solution. Let me stop there.
No, thank you so much. That is great. I wonder if this next question is going to sound nuts or not, but if you were following American politics, or if you're ever on this Twitter thing, you might imagine that ESG is a fad, or in the words of Elon Musk, the devil incarnate, or in the words of some governors in our more southerly states, a bad idea. It seems weirdly controversial, and yet if I listen to you, and pretty much anyone we've interviewed in this space, I would say this is just the language of business. So would any of you like to take a quick stab at this question? Is ESG, just a fad, or the language of business, or come on, we're doing business in Europe, this is not optional?
Yeah, I can give it a start, and Laura, I know you've got something to add, but it really goes back to what is ESG. When I ran GRI, there were 34 34 topic specific standards that broke down along those, you know, much beleaguered abbreviation ESG, environmental, social, and governance. All very important, but as different can be. I mean, when you're trying to look at things like climate change, diversity, and the governance of the board of directors, they're just very different things. Unfortunately, they've all gotten combined under this three-letter abbreviation of ESG, which has now become kind of a political punching bag, let's face it. And so I do think, you know, as Larry Fink said, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the largest asset manager in the world, said he regrets ever using the term because it has become sort of less understood, overused, and again, political. So I do think we have to be more specific about what we're actually talking about, and you know, that term itself has potentially outlived its usefulness, although Bloomberg recently did a study that said most investors still like the term. So you know, I'm much more in favor of using more specific terminology. But Laura, you probably have an opinion on that too.
Thank you, Tim. Well, I appreciate that. And I couldn't agree with you more in terms of what is it that we're talking about, right? So unfortunately, what gets lumped into ESG is also what I would characterize as ratings and ESG ratings. And I think if you take a look at what Elon Musk originally talked about, and I don't follow Elon Musk carefully, but his reaction was not to environmental, social, and governance issues that affected his company. It was the ratings that people assigned to him and his company that he objected so strenuously to. I personally think that ESG still works, and as because we speak English, and probably almost everyone on this call speaks English as a first language, I think it does a disservice to the rest of the world when terms come out of disfavor. And that's really unfortunate, because the words environmental, social, and governance are still good descriptors of a collection of things that we should be taking a look at. And while I do think that there is an opportunity for us to get even more defined, to completely throw out those words does a disservice to people around the world who are trying to also come up to speed in this really important area. And I think that's a really important thing to say. And, you know, is ESG around to stay? It's like, yes, because it is all about opportunity and it is all about risk. And while I would like to talk more about opportunity, I am perfectly happy to have people understand that there are risks if they don't pay attention to it, and to drive behavior change in that way.
Well, just quickly, and I agree with Tim and Laura. I think there's a lot around the syntax of and descriptors of this that has been weaponized, even, I'll say. But another, just to take a little bit of a different direction, that just the question, is it here to stay? I think we have to also remember that publicly traded companies have made public commitments to do certain things, i.e. be carbon neutral, carbon negative by a certain time, and they can't go back on that, or that they would have serious implications. We want to talk to Laura about the risk mitigation. Of course, they can, at the end of the day, buy carbon credits and not actually change their operations, but they really are going to be they've publicly opened themselves up to this scrutiny by making these commitments. And I think that is something that has strengthened the movement. So it's not necessarily only the first movers and the leaders are doing this. You're really seeing this across the board. So even if we just simply look at that through that lens, this will be a topic, like David said, for CEOs at board meetings for decades to come.
And I just add one quick data point on that. COP28 is taking place this week, which is the Global Climate Change Awareness Conference. And in its attendance are over 500 CEOs of companies. that are making the trip over, the investment of time to spend at least, a few days to a week talking about this and how it's going to impact their companies.
Jerry, I'm not sure if you might have frozen up.
I think our host froze. I would, while we're waiting, I'd give one other statistic on why we think it's here to stay. Just in my world, in packaging and packaging sustainability, we recently built a database of global regulation. There's been a lot of regulations proposed, which will change behavior of companies. And we looked at 59 countries and assembled over 600 regulations that have been proposed or implemented just in packaging sustainability alone. And so there's really a tidal wave of change that's coming.
Yeah, right. I think Jerry mentioned in the intro, I mean, just to do business in Europe alone right now, there are certain thresholds you have to meet. And there's going to be financial implications from a tax perspective that you're, whether from an import perspective also. So it just is starting to be too expensive not to address this and be ahead of the curve.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Shayla, because one of the things that we've seen in our work is the impact of the European Union's privacy law, right? So European Union introduced the GDPR, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, at least. And that has informed businesses large and small all over the world, because you can't afford to have 2 different systems for privacy. I think the CSRD and the regulations that go with it are going to do this exact same thing, especially for multinational corporations, which is companies can't afford to have the system that they're going to report on in Europe and then the system that they're going to report on in the rest of the world. So they're setting up their systems now in order to be able to report in the way the European Union will accept that. And, I just look at it, and it's not that what the SEC is doing is unimportant. It is important. It's just lagging now significantly behind what companies are going to have to do and what they're going to start requiring their suppliers to do. And I think that's a really good point. Thanks, Tim.
Welcome, decoder ring over here. No, I totally agree with my fellow panelists that, policy is a major driver, but it's not the only major driver. We talked about investors before, we talked about customers before, and being kind of a fossil myself, I can tell you that back in the day, it wasn't easy to get attention of the C-suite on these matters. Typically, it had to be some sort of excursion in the press, like I mentioned with Apple, or a proxy resolution, which we got all the time on these matters. But that's changed. And I think as it relates to our audience here of MBAs and young professionals, the issue's been kicked upstairs. I think there can't be a CEO or a C-suite that doesn't speak sustainability anymore, because that comes along with the job, frankly. These issues have been integrated into corporate strategy, into planning, into even board activities. And just to tie it all together, one of the policies that we're seeing going across the world is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. And if you look at, just to get real granular for a minute, there's 11 disclosures within that. 8 of them are qualitative and focus on things like corporate strategy and board governance with regard to climate change. So it's very, very clear that this is all shifted. And I think it's created some job opportunities in corporate life that really have a strong sustainability element. So I think you're in the right program and asking the right questions. I see our venerable host is back from Zoom purgatory, and we're happy to welcome you back. Jerry, do you want to jump back in here?
Jerry, we have not proceeded on with any additional questions.
And you're on mute.
Sorry about that. That has never happened before and couldn't happen at a more embarrassing time. But thank you for your willingness to freestyle on whatever things that you got to there. So sorry about that. That was kind of shocking. So the next question that I had was kind of the meat of the matter, which is about the specific skills and frameworks that businesses are looking for in new MBA recruits. So this was something that Shayla, you had sort of schooled me on this when we had our first conversation about, like, it is not like be really good at debating Milton Friedman or know what these metrics are. It was much more tangible, that, as you said, companies have made these commitments, and they're not going to back out of them. So what advice would you give to, say, an MBA student? What should they be learning? What skills should they be gathering to be able to engage in this world?
Yeah, I can kick it off. So I think, first of all, there's not just one type of work within sustainability. You can just, I mean, there's the engineering skill set, there's the policy skill set, there's the corporate financing skill set. You know, there's so many different areas for you. And again, as we are growing with the needs of the market, there's just it's going to be exponential. So my first piece of advice is really, what are you interested in, and what are your natural, where's your natural inclinations? If you're kind of starting as a generalist model, then I think there are some specific things that you can start getting more, toolkits around. Some of the things that I see kind of coming across our desks a lot are issues around supply chain. So, David, within packaging, that's a huge part of supply chain. Things around with energy transition. So there's going to be a lot around, having a mindset around, basic engineering principles and how the energy systems work is really important. Especially I think around the IRA, IIJA, there's a lot of project finance going on. So I'm kind of thinking about just skills you can learn in an MBA program. So project finance, understanding the timelines around that and what goes into it. So much around reporting, and I would almost say, like, audit assurance and what that really looks like. Those are some of the things that are on the top of my mind. I'm sure there's other heavy hitters, but those are just things I'm thinking of without referencing any notes right now. But I also think whoever's on the backgrounds of those who are on this panel, other than myself, have this massive industry experience that speaks to the skill set that more senior leaders have in this space, whether it's kind of industries like Dow, where there's a lot of, chemical production. That is an area where there's investing a lot in sustainability, of course, with packaging, and then Tim with both the policy and kind of an EPA, and then of course the ratings background. So one of the things I did and continue to do is look to someone 15, 20 years, your senior, and follow their path, reverse engineer what they've learned and what they did, and try to find yourself in situations where you can learn some of those skills.
Fantastic. And David, that feels like a tee up for you and your career path.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Look, I think so a BBA or an MBA is a great generalist skill set to work in a job that will have sustainability. I think, as we started off framing at the beginning, sustainability is going to be a part of really everything that gets done. To me, it feels like kind of manufacturing and safety. 100 years ago, safety wasn't a big consideration, and then it became one. And now today, you don't ever look at manufacturing without thinking about, is this safe for the workers and how can I make it safe? Sustainability is going to become that, just sort of part of how we do business. I do think, though, that knowledge, in addition to a generalist kind of business background, knowledge will help. It is very confusing out there. Consumers are super concerned, but confused. Regulators are concerned, but confused. Companies aren't quite sure how to prioritize what they should do when it comes to sustainability. And that does play over a little bit more into other elements of ESG, but especially in sustainability. So I think becoming knowledgeable about where the science is versus where the non-science is, and what really makes a difference and an impact, will be helpful.
Fantastic. And Laura?
Yeah, I would just want to build on what both Shayla and David have said. And I think one of the things that's super important to understand about integrating sustainability, and that is what everybody is going to be held responsible for doing, is to understand that you cannot optimize a small part of the system and expect then that the whole system will be optimized. You always have to look at the entire system. That's, and in a micro analysis, that's looking at life cycle assessment, for example, for a specific product or a specific project. But overall, it's looking at all of the different things that you have to take into consideration and understanding where you can make the trade-offs that will have the most positive effect overall. I think the thing that we get really caught up in sometimes, and this is where you have flavor of the month, is where we go for, driving for one aspect of sustainability and leaving everything else in its path. So if we go for, zero emissions, but you use copious amounts of water and kill everything on your site, so there's no biodiversity left, that's also not optimal. So I would say this idea of being able to think and understand and be curious about systems, and also to be able to communicate about that, are really critical skill sets.
Fantastic. And Tim, what would you like to add to this?
Yeah, so when I did my lengthy introduction, I was kind of going on and on about how sustainability and companies it was a man bites dog story at the beginning. And that's changed. But what hasn't changed is business is still about business. And what I'm talking about is you really need to have business skills. And business skills now have expanded to include risks and opportunities that come from this area of sustainability. Now, as we've discussed throughout this webinar, sustainability is a very broad topic. My point is, be good at one thing in business. Be good at marketing, accounting, any kind of business focus, but then add to that some knowledge of what sustainability means to that function. Because I think that makes you that special unicorn that consulting firms are looking for, that companies are looking for, because you understand both. But don't try to be everything to everybody. Be good at one thing and then add those skill sets alongside of that. Oh,
Fantastic. Yep. Thank you. I am back. So one of the questions that we got from people viewing was, I'm a first-year student, like new to the business school. What can I do to get into this field? What can I learn about ESG? How should I structure my experiences to be in a better position to join this world? Because you came at it from really different perspectives, either evolved into it, or in Shayla's case, you said you were passionate about this from high school onward, so you already knew what you wanted to do. And some people is more of a latter day conversion. What would you advise someone at a fairly junior level if they were really passionate about this field, that they really wanted to make a difference, say in sustainability? What should they be doing? What kind of experiences should they be having?
I'd like to build on one of the things that Tim said, Jerry, because I think it's really, really important. And just like I said before, where companies can't afford to have, dual reporting systems, they also can't afford anymore to have dual functions. So there's supply chain, and there's operations, and there's logistics, and there's R&D, and there's product development, and there's market development, and there's financial reporting, and there's a whole host of very well understood business functions that your folks are going to be studying, right? So I would say pick the one that's your favorite. Pick the one that you are talented at and super interested in. And I think everyone on this panel will promise you that there is an aspect of sustainability that you can integrate into that function and be that, as Tim said, that special unicorn. You know, one of the things that we didn't mention in all of the lists, and, you know, we could probably keep checking off the functions, is human resources. But, you know, a company's ability to be successful does still rely on their ability to attract, engage, develop, and retain employees. And more, that's a really important thing to be considering about sustainability as well. It becomes an important part of the employee value proposition. And it's an area, for example, in HR that can't be underestimated.
Yeah, and I can add to that and just speak on my personal experience, and it really does echo what Tim and Laura just said, is when I made a decision, I want to be a future leader of sustainability. I knew that in order to get a seat at that boardroom table, I couldn't just talk about sustainability. I need to know about how the business runs and what makes everything else run, and then layer on sustainability. And there are certainly roles that are super specific. Like if you are working for a firm that does life cycle assessments, there is a role for you to do that, and that is what you do. But if you want to have a broader perspective, so you want to combine this business corporate leadership with sustainability, I said, if I don't touch sustainability for my first 2 years of consulting, that's fine, because I know I need to learn more. Just, you know, develop that business acumen, and then start specializing. So, but I do think there are things you can do while you're in business school. Again, being not so far away from that, clubs, nonprofit consulting projects, international development. I mean, I'm sure Ross has very similar things. So I think there are experiences you can garner, but I would be prepared to develop that business acumen, find another area that you can become, you know, the go-to person on, and then layer sustainability, because then you're going to be an expendable resource, non-expendable resource.
You know, one of the things that came up in my conversations with experts on this was better understanding of public policy. So Shayla, you mentioned along the way the IRA, and didn't say Inflation Reduction Act because it's so sort of built into our daily experience. But to what extent would you advise business students to become more immersed in the world of policies? Like, do I have to know what the EU is? And do I have to understand what the IRA says and infrastructure acts? Like, I'm definitely going to learn the discounted cash flow analysis. Do I have to be able to translate, policy into business practice, or can I still skip that?
I'm probably the wrong person to answer this because I also have a master's in policy, but that also is kind of from interest. But I do think it is valuable. But I'll defer to the other panelists.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. I think some basic knowledge of policy is super important. It is so front and center and accelerating in Europe and the US, really almost in every part of the world. And so having kind of a newspaper level knowledge of general issues that are affecting an industry that you're looking in is super important, because it's too big to miss. I think if you're passionate about it, and I love what Laura and Shayla said, then go deep, but you don't have to.
All right, thank you for that. We do have some questions coming in from the audience as well, and I'd love to make sure that we can make this interactive. So Elizabeth asks, given that the panelists have experienced the evolution of the ESG realm in business, how do the panelists foresee the evolution of the ESG realm and industry in the next 5 to 10 years? And will governmental policies play a substantial role in the future of ESG?
I can start. I mean, I think policy is always a lagging indicator. It's super important, as David just said, that we have knowledge of it, because certainly you don't want to be out of compliance. But investors have been clamoring for reliable, comparable, decision-useful climate information for 10 years. The SEC issued their first bulletin about it. I think it was 2012. So it's not new. And just now the SEC is struggling to get out their very first regulation on that matter. So I think policy is important to watch and be aware of, but also understand that it is lagging behind where the debate is now. And very clearly, we're seeing ESG becoming super important, as we discussed throughout this webinar, in just determining a business's strategy and identifying risks and opportunities. There's true value, not just in saving resources, which is super important, but also understanding where, climate change might impact your value chain. Or I was in a startup, as Jerry mentioned in the beginning of the discussion, Persephone, a carbon accounting software company that raised over 150 million in its first couple of years. When you think about that, that's a company that just wouldn't have existed without the paradigm that we're in now. So there's real opportunity here as well. And I think it's important to understand that that's the leading indicator. Where are the next risks? Where are the next opportunities? Not, necessarily just focusing on policy.
I will add to that a little bit of my crystal ball gazing, and I can't remember which one of my fellow panelists mentioned this, but building on what Tim just said about having auditable information is going to become increasingly important. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting to think about is that the demand for clear financial auditable statements that were publicly available for publicly traded companies, that's only 90 years old. It's 90 years old next year. It's like we act like that's been around, forever, and it hasn't. And so now as we come here, we're on the cusp of more and more requirements in terms of that auditable information, because it's being driven by the people who have the capital. So it's the investors who want that, as everyone has mentioned before. And what I see coming is that in the future, there will be a chief reporting officer, and financials will be part of what that person's responsibility will be. But she will also be responsible for both social and environmental reporting as well, because that will be a return on investment in a different way. I just was working with a client last year. It was so interesting. Inside of their organization, they are now developing, this is a pretty major manufacturing company, a return on water. And they're doing an assessment for all their products, not just a life cycle assessment, but no kidding, what is the water implications for them to manufacture that, because they see that as a real risk and an opportunity coming forward if they can do that. So I just think that, that kind of chief reporting, auditable information that's material to your company is coming.
Just to add there, and I think it's that what we've been mentioning, that's also driven by the risk management of this. There's, like we said, there's a great graphic out there that honestly might have come from BCG, because you guys are really good at these kinds of graphics. But it's showing there's so much that has to be done to mitigate the ESG risk, and then the opportunity. And I think the reporting element and the investors are really, there's the amount of risk attached to ESG issues now is growing every year. And so I think that really ties back into kind of that risk opportunity trade-off, and making sure that you're covering yourself for that.
So this is sparking in me a sort of an observation that, as we've talked about ESG, Laura pointed out early on, well, each of these buckets might be coherent on its own. You put the three together and it's a bit of a weird combination. We haven't really talked as much about the S, and I wonder if you see anything sort of interesting coming down the pike here. So Laura, you mentioned the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which created the 10K, which is everything we know about publicly listed corporations, their balance sheets, or their income statements, was mandated in 1934. The part about people and what you need to report about people was basically nothing until 1973. And then they said how many employees worked there for about 30 years. And then they added how much does a median employee make, and compare that to the CEO. And it is shocking how little we know about S, the people part. Other than count of employees globally, we know shockingly little. So I organized a conference with friends at the Human Capital Management Coalition that we held at Ross last May, where we got together investors, labor economists, HR people, data nerds, management professors, people that use government data, and got them all into a room to say, what could we do to get better information about people? It was really being driven by investors, that they're saying, look, if almost all your employees can go on social media and say, we quit unless the CEO comes back, then we don't care how many machines you have or how many railroad ties you own. Like, we're not that interested in the tangible assets. We want to know about the people and how you're managing them. And I wonder if you see this as being, how you see this as relating to the broader ESG agenda and that notion of sort of the chief reporting officer or the ESG controller. I know that was a big question, but
well, I think it's a really interesting point, and I'm going to ask. I'm sure Tim and Shayla and David also have insights into this, but the social implications has been part of the GRI reporting for a really long time. And one of the other things that I'll just point your students to is SASB, which is the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, now part of ISSB, which is in turn now part of IFRS. And that's the International Financial Reporting Group too. So it's really interesting to see how all of that leadership is coming together, which personally I think is nothing short of a leadership miracle, but we'll just leave that there. But one of the things that the SASB standards have for something like 70 industries are what are the environmental, social, and governance issues that are most material to this particular industry. And I happened to work with a client on a policy that they were developing in the hospitality industry. And it turns out that turnover in that industry is a huge, that's a social aspect of reporting behind that particular industry. And then you can take a deeper dive into, so why is it that people are turning over? But that's an impact, for example, that can be reported. And then people will be interested and curious about why it is that they're having that kind of impact, the same way that they would be curious about having the impact of reporting why your margin is falling, right? So it's that same type of thing, in my opinion.
One thing every company has in common is human beings, and investors know that without good employee engagement and effective retention, productivity suffers and the company's prospects are dim. So I do think that those issues are very much front and center. But what's really interesting in the way you presented it is, I don't know if people are following the Sam Altman case, but the future of this has not been written yet. I mean, Anthropic, which is a competitor with OpenAI, has adopted the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is a document more than 60 years old, and the Apple Terms of Service as their code of conduct, because they don't know. And no one knows, what AI is going to bring to us in terms of social matters. So it's not just your own workforce, it's how your company's products and services will affect the social conditions of all of us. And that's the part that hasn't been written yet. I think it's fascinating, but I think that's the piece that your students are going to inherit as they enter the workforce.
We're getting close on time, but to piggyback on that, so I think there's a huge element of your internal social policies. But what I'm seeing is that companies are starting to think about how equitable are their products and services, and what is the social impact of those outside. Because I think we've, through the wave of DEI over the past 10 years, we have taken most companies have done a pretty good job, mostly because they had to, on the internal stuff. But I do exactly what Tim said. We're going to have to be shifting that to how do your products and services and your entire value chain affect everybody else.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for this. So we are coming up. We have about 30 seconds left. So I have to say what I'm hearing from this panel is that if you were a business school student, you would be checking out that ESG concentration to be able to participate in this exciting cutting edge dialogue. And I have to thank you all for joining me. This was great. This was a bit sort of, we wanted it to be a bit more informal, a bit more lively, and I'm delighted that you all joined us. So thank you to Laura, Shayla, David, and Tim. And thank you, students, for joining us. If you have any questions about the concentration, give me a holler. And thank you very much. We hope you have a magical upcoming holiday. Take care.
Thank you.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jerry.